Breaking. Diddy's case just took a shocking turn. Before you watch, hit like and subscribe right now for the most explosive updates. Turn on notifications or risk missing the biggest revelations. Power, money, music, and murder. Behind the velvet curtains of flashing lights and Grammy speeches, a darker beat was pulsing, one that nobody wanted to hear. Until now. The courtroom was packed, cameras weren't allowed, but the world was watching. Today, the empire of Sean Diddy Combs wasn't being celebrated, it was being put on trial. They called him a king, an icon, the man who took hip-hop from street corners to skyscrapers. Sean Diddy Combs built a name so powerful that it became a brand, synonymous with hustle, with glamour, with the American dream spun in platinum and champagne. But now, that dream was being dissected, piece by piece, in the cold light of a federal courtroom. Outside, news vans lined the block. Protesters screamed on both sides of the barricade. Some held signs that read, "Respect Black Wealth." Others held up photos of victims, lost names, closed cases. Inside, the mood was tense. Cameras weren't allowed, but every word spoken was destined for headlines. The courtroom was silent until the gavel struck. The charges were heavy: money laundering, obstruction of justice, conspiracy, and accessory to homicide. At the heart of it all was a man whose face had once adorned Times Square, now sitting stoically in a tailored charcoal suit, watching his empire being unraveled by the state. The prosecution began with a simple idea. Behind every beat was a cover-up. Behind every party, a payoff. Behind every million-dollar deal, a list of silenced names. They said this wasn't about a rapper. It was about a syndicate, a machine of intimidation, manipulation, and control. They didn't begin with the most famous stories. Not Biggie, not Shine. They began with a name few knew, Latasha Rivers. She had been an intern in the promotions department at Bad Boy in 2003. She told the jury about the mood inside the headquarters, about the way everyone acted like they were walking on glass. The mood of fear, the unspoken rule that you don't ask questions, you don't speak about what you see, and you never, under any circumstance, cross the boss. Her voice trembled as she recounted a man named Miguel who had worked in logistics. He had confided in her about money missing from event budgets, funds being rerouted to companies with no real addresses. He joked that if he ever went missing, it wasn't an accident. A week later, he was beaten, left bleeding in a Bronx alleyway. He left New York the next morning, never came back, never spoke again. It was the first of many stories that painted the Bad Boy empire as more than a record label. Witness after witness emerged, each with their own thread, each connecting to a larger tapestry of secrecy, power, and fear. Former employees, artists who once stood on stage alongside Combs, assistants, bodyguards, a studio intern who claimed to have seen burner phones passed between executives, a stylist who said they were once asked to clean blood off a backstage carpet before a video shoot. And then came C.J. Wilkins, the former head of private security for Combs. He described the unspoken rules, the coded language used to authorize threats. He recounted a meeting in which Combs referred to an upcoming rapper leaking unreleased music and said simply, "I want it handled." A week later, that rapper was robbed and hospitalized. He never mentioned Bad Boy again. CJ also mentioned Kim Porter, the mother of 3 of Combs' children. Her death in 2018 had long raised eyebrows. Official reports stated pneumonia. But CJ told the jury Kim had been planning to speak to the press about Combs' financial activities. She had hinted at knowledge of things that could ruin him. Weeks later, she was gone. The prosecution couldn't prove foul play, no autopsy evidence had surfaced, but the implication was chilling. Financial analysts took the stand next. They introduced what they called the silent ledger, an encrypted spreadsheet uncovered from a cloud account linked to a Bahamian shell company. The ledger listed transactions, vague payments labeled as Consultant C, Cleaner F, and Entertainment Fee X. The sums were massive. The dates coincided with high-profile settlements, lawsuits that disappeared, and violent incidents that were never prosecuted. The prosecution alleged this ledger was the master record of a hidden economy, one designed not to build business, but to suppress risk, to erase threats. The prosecutor's voice never rose above a whisper, but every sentence hit like a hammer. They put forth their own witnesses, colleagues who called him a visionary, a mentor, a father figure. Quincy Brown, his adopted son, testified that Diddy was demanding, but not dangerous, that he was harsh because the industry was ruthless, that everything he had built was meant to protect, not destroy. Diddy himself took the stand, calm, composed. He looked each juror in the eye. He admitted he had enemies. He admitted he had secrets. But he denied the charges, denied any role in orchestrating violence, denied ordering cover-ups, denied even knowing about the silent ledger. He said his accountants and business managers had wide autonomy, that his brand was so big he couldn't monitor every decision, that sometimes people acted on his behalf without his approval. But never once, he insisted, did he order anything illegal. The jury listened, silently. Some scribbled notes. Others stared at him. A few looked away. But then came the bombshell, the pivot that shifted the courtroom into full-blown national crisis. The prosecution connected Diddy to the 1997 murder of Christopher Wallace, Biggie Smalls. They didn't accuse him directly of pulling a trigger. They introduced sealed FBI documents, private investigator testimony, and financial trails suggesting Diddy had paid to halt investigations, to suppress evidence, to close the door on anyone who kept asking questions. The implication: the death of Biggie wasn't just a tragedy. It was a liability, one the empire couldn't afford. By now, the courtroom had stopped being about guilt or innocence. It had become a public reckoning. Outside, debates flared. Was this justice or a targeted attack on a black billionaire? Was the system finally catching up with celebrity corruption? Or was it exploiting fame to score political points? And still, the trial went on. As the weeks dragged into months, the courtroom turned into a stage not just for justice, but for memory, for old wounds, for whispered rumors turned sworn testimony. Each new revelation became a trending topic, a viral clip, a dividing line in pop culture. There were no more throwback tributes airing on cable, no classic bad boy medleys playing in arenas. People began to ask, how much of this music was built on pain? How many of the smiles in those glossy magazine covers were hiding fear? How many careers ended in silence? The jury, made up of men and women from all walks of life, carried the weight of legacy on their shoulders. Some of them had danced to "I'll Be Missing You." Others had watched their children grow up idolizing the empire Diddy built. But now they were being asked to weigh evidence, not nostalgia, truth, not marketing. In closing arguments, the prosecution didn't ask for revenge. They asked for accountability. They said power should not be a shield, that empire should not equal immunity, that behind the charisma, behind the fame, there were people who lost lives, families who buried loved ones, dreams that ended not in failure, but in fear. They reminded the jury that silence had a cost, and that it was often paid in blood. The defense closed with a portrait of ambition. They spoke of Harlem, of the orphaned boy who rose from nothing, who changed music, changed fashion, changed the narrative. They said his only crime was trying to survive in an industry that devours its own. They said he became a symbol of success, and now that symbol was being crucified for being too visible, too wealthy, too powerful. They asked the jury not to punish vision. When the jury went into deliberation, the world held its breath. Speculation ran wild. Cable news turned it into a countdown. Industry insiders whispered about who would be next if Diddy fell. Other moguls, other legends. The walls of protection had started to crack. 3 days later, the jury returned. Not guilty on conspiracy, guilty on obstruction of justice, guilty on money laundering, hung jury on accessory to homicide. The room erupted. Diddy didn't flinch. He stood, composed, lips pressed tight. Outside, the crowd split in two, some cheering, some weeping, some chanting his name in defiance. In the days that followed, the consequences came swiftly. Sponsorships vanished overnight. Clothing lines were delisted. Endorsement deals went into quiet termination. His likeness was pulled from TV retrospectives. His star on the Hollywood Walk of Fame was defaced. His name, once a symbol of aspiration, now whispered with hesitation. But that was just the beginning. The civil suits followed like an avalanche. A class action suit from former dancers and assistants who claimed verbal abuse, unsafe work environments, and forced silence under airtight NDAs. A wrongful death claim from the family of a former producer who was found dead in a Miami hotel under mysterious circumstances years prior. Multiple artists claimed withheld royalties and financial coercion. One woman, a former backup singer, came forward with allegations of physical intimidation after she refused to sign a release form covering a yacht party where drugs and violence allegedly occurred. Each suit brought new headlines. Each headline stripped another layer off the image. And in the middle of it all, Sean Combs was placed under house arrest. The mansion in Bel Air that once hosted the elite of Hollywood and hip-hop now stood quiet. No more pool parties, no more camera crews, no more midnight recording sessions with champagne in one hand and a platinum pen in the other. The estate had become a fortress, not of luxury, but of exile. Inside, he walked alone, monitored, watched. The glass walls now felt like cages. He had once been the master of visibility, the king of appearances. Now he was a man in hiding from the world he helped shape. He started writing again. Not lyrics, but thoughts. Scribbled notes on napkins, margins of invoices, old tour schedules. He replayed old tapes, remastered unreleased demos, heard the echoes of the past in every hook. One night, he went into the studio and found a dusty hard drive marked Big 1997. He hesitated, then played it. The voice of Christopher Wallace filled the silence. That unmistakable growl, that charisma, the hunger, the brilliance. For the first time in a long time, Diddy cried, not for the trial, not for his image, but for what was lost, for what was buried in the name of the brand, for the friend who died too young, too violently, too unresolved. Outside the mansion, the media had turned to new scandals, the hashtags had faded, the public moved on to the next outrage. But in the quiet, in the isolation, the echoes of his empire still haunted the man who once commanded it. He no longer spoke of revenge, no longer issued press statements, no more Instagram lives or surprise drops. He simply existed, surrounded by wealth, but consumed by memory. Meanwhile, the music industry itself faced a reckoning. Labels re-examined their contracts. Executives were quietly dismissed. NDAs began to be challenged in court. Young artists started demanding accountability, transparency, equity. A new generation was rising, one that refused to be silent. Some still defended him, claimed he was misunderstood, a victim of systemic takedown. Others said it was about time. That power without consequence was a disease, that maybe, just maybe, justice could stretch even to the top of the charts. And then there were those who mourned, not for Diddy, but for the dream, for what he once represented, for what he made possible, for what he could have been if the machine hadn't devoured the man. They called it the fall of a titan. But in truth, it wasn't a fall. It was an unraveling, thread by thread, beat by beat. An empire built on sound now consumed by silence. Months passed, but the reverberations didn't stop. The courtroom may have closed its doors, but its echo kept traveling. Through offices, through studios, through every boardroom that once brokered deals behind velvet curtains. Sean Combs was no longer just a man on trial. He had become a symbol, depending on who you asked, either of power gone unchecked or a system that never truly allowed a black man to rise without dragging him back down. Entertainment networks began scrubbing old footage. Reunion specials were postponed indefinitely. Interviews once filled with laughter now sat like artifacts of a time no one wanted to revisit. No one said his name out loud anymore at industry galas. They'd just pause, shift uncomfortably, and move on. Diddy wasn't blacklisted. He was ghosted by the machine he once fed. In the corridors of Revolt TV, the media platform he founded, his framed image came down in silence. Executives denied it publicly, but sources inside claimed advertisers had given quiet ultimatums. Keep him visible, and the money disappears. Internally, producers were told to pivot away from legacy content and shift focus toward new voices, new sounds, new leadership. It wasn't just corporate. The culture was changing too. Young rappers started speaking differently. In interviews, they no longer praised the old gatekeepers. They questioned them. They criticized them. Some even called them predators in suits. Artists once too afraid to speak now tweeted freely. One by one, the myths began to collapse. From the ashes of the trial rose a broader conversation. Podcasts ran series on the golden age of hip-hop exploitation. YouTubers posted hour-long exposés. Former label interns began writing memoirs. Diddy's name was always there, in the subtext, in the footnotes, in the patterns. The civil suits advanced, depositions leaked, statements were made public. A chilling portrait emerged, not just of one man, but of an era. An ecosystem that rewarded silence, where abuse was normalized and wrapped in luxury, where loyalty wasn't just expected, it was enforced. One former assistant described a culture of absolute submission. Artists were told where to live, what to wear, who to be seen with. Dissent meant erasure. Disobedience meant exile. She recounted being sent to deliver a briefcase of money to a consultant whose only job seemed to be making problems vanish. Another woman, a former producer's girlfriend, gave a harrowing account of being drugged at a private after-party hosted at a yacht off the coast of St. Bart's. She said her calls for help were laughed off. She was told to sign an NDA before she'd even been given clothes. Her story became a spark. More followed. What had once been rumor had become record. Meanwhile, Diddy remained silent. On house arrest, his legal team worked around the clock, appealing the money laundering conviction and preparing for a federal asset investigation. He was no longer fighting for his image. He was fighting to avoid prison time. In solitude, he began writing what insiders claimed was an autobiography. Not for publication, for himself, for his children, for legacy. He called it the blueprint of a king. But no publisher had touched it. Not yet. He spent his days pacing, reading, rewatching old performances. In the evenings, he'd walk into his private studio and listen to the catalog. Faith Evans, 112, Mace, Biggie, Loon, Total. He'd listen for hours, sometimes with pride, sometimes with regret, sometimes in tears. A visitor, one of the few still allowed in, later told a journalist that Diddy seemed like a man trapped between two timelines, the boy who dreamed big and the man who became too big to feel anything real. He wasn't angry, He wasn't defensive. He was lost. And perhaps that was the truest punishment. Because while the courts decided legality, the people decided legacy. BET Awards rescinded his lifetime honor. Universities pulled speaking engagements. A documentary he had funded on black entrepreneurship was removed from streaming platforms. It didn't matter if he was guilty of every accusation. He had been marked, culturally, if not legally. And yet, there were still those who defended him. Some said the industry owed him more than it could ever repay, that he gave a platform to black artists when few others would, that he normalized black excellence in boardrooms, that he inspired millions of young kids from broken neighborhoods to believe in their value. They asked, what about the system that built him? What about the enablers who stayed silent? What about the lawyers who drafted the NDAs, the executives who counted the money, the brands that turned a blind eye as long as the check cleared? Was Diddy the disease, or just the most visible symptom? The questions echoed, and in those questions, the myth unraveled further. Because the truth was messy. He had built something extraordinary. He had changed culture. He had made history. But he had also broken people, and now he was forced to live among the ruins of his creation. The industry he once ruled was moving on. Quietly, swiftly. There was no official ceremony, just a shift. New faces on magazine covers, new names in executive seats, young artists asking different questions, demanding more, settling less. And somewhere in Bel Air, behind security gates and silent halls, the man who once declared, "I thought I told you that we won't stop," now sat still. The world had kept going. The beat had changed. And for the first time, Diddy wasn't in control of the rhythm. As the months turned into a year, a strange quiet surrounded the name Sean Combs. Not just silence in the media, but a cultural pause, an unresolved breath held by an industry unsure whether to mourn, distance, or remember. Once a man whose name opened doors, Diddy now lived behind several locked ones. The walls of his Bel Air mansion, now patrolled by armed guards and monitored by federal GPS, held the echoes of his former life. A few loyal staff remained, mostly out of contractual obligation or personal loyalty, but the phones barely rang. There were no party invites, no new collaborations, just static. He began to age in isolation. It wasn't visible on the outside. He still dressed well, his hair cut sharp, his beard trimmed. But in his eyes, something had dulled, something that even decades of wealth and applause could not resurrect. That fire, that strut, that certainty that he was untouchable. It was gone now. But outside, the conversations continued. Every music panel, every black culture roundtable, every industry podcast came back to the same questions. What do we do with our fallen icons? How do we reconcile legacy with liability? Was the house that Bad Boy built one of art or exploitation? For every voice that denounced him, there was one that hesitated. Some people simply couldn't let go of what he represented. The symbolism, the upward mobility, the pride of seeing a Harlem boy build an empire with nothing but grit and ambition. And yet, those defenses grew quieter with each new revelation. Court filings kept surfacing, sealed depositions, old texts, hidden contracts. Every new document was a brick torn from the myth. One exchange between a former tour manager and a financial advisor revealed the use of comfort funds. Untraceable cash stockpiled for emergencies involving press, injuries, and public behavior cleanup. It was a term used multiple times in Bad Boy inner circles. Then there were the testimonies from therapists, psychologists, and former confidants who began to speak not only about Diddy's actions, but about the culture he created. They described a man obsessed with control, someone who had learned early that vulnerability was a weakness and power was safety, someone who built an empire not to lead others, but to never be left behind. The irony was bitter. In trying to shield himself from abandonment, he had driven away everyone. Somewhere along the way, the young hustler who danced behind Biggie, who screamed, take that," had become a general on a battlefield no one else wanted to fight on anymore. He wasn't alone because he was hated. He was alone because everyone was finally unafraid. In private, he continued writing. Not music, but long letters to his children. Letters he didn't mail. He kept them in a drawer beside his bed. Some were filled with wisdom. Others were apologies he could never say out loud. In one, he admitted he had lost sight of who he was chasing. Was it success, respect, or the ghosts of the past? One day, a former bodyguard visited him, a man who had worked with him in the 90s. They sat by the pool, saying little, just staring out over the hills. Eventually, the bodyguard asked, "Would you do it differently, if you could?" Diddy didn't answer at first. He just nodded slowly. And for a moment, there was no mogul, no headlines, no legend. Just a man looking backward through the haze of memory, trying to make sense of what he had spent a lifetime building and breaking. He still had his wealth. But the empire? That was gone. Not in flames, but in pieces, drifting in the court records, the confessionals, the silence of those who once called him boss. And perhaps the most poetic part of all was this. In the end, it wasn't a rival that took him down. It wasn't the police. It wasn't a scandalous album or diss track. It was the truth. The truth that couldn't be remixed, couldn't be delayed, couldn't be drowned out with diamonds or Ciroc bottles or shout-outs at award shows. The truth that lingered. The truth that always comes due. The world had moved on, not in a cruel or dismissive way, just in the way that time always does. New headlines, new stars, new scandals. Diddy's name still surfaced now and then, an offhand mention in a think piece, a question on a podcast, a lyric flipped in someone else's verse. But the urgency had faded. The firestorm had turned to embers. And yet, something had shifted in the culture. There was more caution now, less blind hero worship. Young artists entering the game were no longer eager to just sign with the biggest label. They asked about ownership, about equity, about transparency. The Diddy trial had, in a strange and unintended way, become a blueprint. Not for success, but for self-preservation. In high schools and college campuses, lectures on black entrepreneurship now included conversations about power ethics. Professors quoted the trial in sociology courses. Aspiring producers referenced the case in business plans. The story had transcended music. It had become a parable, a cautionary tale, a tragedy. Somewhere in a Brooklyn museum, an exhibit was quietly curated, The Price of the Crown. It included photographs of Combs in his early years, early bad boy marketing, rare vinyls, but also legal transcripts and anonymous victim accounts. It was controversial, powerful, painful. Visitors walked through with headphones on, listening to Diddy's discography while reading what had happened behind the scenes. Some wept, some raged. Others simply stood in silence, caught in the tension between art and accountability. Elsewhere, on a streaming service, a documentary series premiered, The Real Empire. Its tagline read, "When the music fades, what remains?" It was watched by millions in its first week, not for gossip, but because people wanted to understand, to fill in the blanks between fame and fallout. In one interview, a former bad boy executive said it best. Diddy wasn't just a man, he was a moment. And when a moment like that ends, it leaves a shadow. We're all still walking through it. And what of the man himself? In year 2 of his house arrest, Sean Combs applied for a quiet release of assets to cover legal debts and mounting settlements. He sold properties, downsized, a mansion in Atlanta, the studio complex in Miami, his private jet, his publishing rights, once the crown jewel of his career, were quietly auctioned off to a corporate holding firm. He released a public statement once, a typed letter, no press conference, no Instagram Live. In it, he wrote, "I gave my life to this industry. I rose where no one thought I could. I made mistakes. Some I can never undo. To those I hurt, I offer no excuse, only reflection. Time has humbled me and taught me that power without grace becomes a prison. I'm living with that now. I hope others learn from it before they build their own." It was signed simply, Sean. It didn't go viral, but it was read. And maybe that was enough. Because there was nothing more he could give, nothing more he could sell, nothing more he could protect. The music was still there, on playlists, in car speakers, in the corners of memories, but now it played differently. Not in celebration, but in echo. The lyrics sounded heavier, the hooks more haunted. It was all still brilliant, but no longer innocent. And maybe that's what hurt the most, because Sean Combs had done what few ever do. He had shaped a generation, not just with music, but with aspiration. He gave millions the courage to dream bigger, louder, bolder. But in the end, he had become a mirror, showing us not just what's possible, but what's lost when ambition refuses to answer to consequence. And in that final, brutal symmetry, Bad Boy Blues found its place, not just in court records or documentaries, but in history. Not the kind sung about in award shows, but the kind whispered in truth, where empires fall quietly, where the rhythm never dies, but the meaning changes, where the beat goes on, but the man who once created it fades out. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification button for continuous Diddy court trials as more investigations on Diddy's case unfolds.